Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and this one is huge. This is the biggest game we ever ran, ever. This was the big crisis of 1997, and it had been a long time coming. The beginning of this starts with Jay Mora, and he was the game master right before I took over. He ran our games when we were in high school, and he assumed that the game would die when we graduated from high school. So, hot on the heels of Terminator 2 Judgment Day, he ran this game where a character from 1992 went forwards in time 5 years and witnessed all this stuff going wrong in 1997. And at the end of that adventure, that character made it back to his own home time again and started to warn people that the end of the world was coming. And so for 5 years, we had been talking about how time was ticking down, and that on August 29th of 1997, it was going to be Judgment Day. We were going to have to deal with some really massive stuff. Um, and so as that time was approaching and I took over as the game master, I kind of inherited that problem, right? And I had no idea what I was going to run. And the other two guys that were running a lot of games in that era, not nearly as much as me, they would run games maybe about a tenth of the time, and I would do it, you know, the rest of it, the majority of the time. But those two guys were Howard Warnes and Greg Sheets. And I can't remember now who suggested it. It might have been Howard, but I said, I need to run this huge event. And he said, well, that's a no-brainer. Run the Crisis on Infinite Earths. And I was like, well, doesn't that take place in the 80s? And he was like, well, but there's like time travel involved. Because like at one point in the comic book, there are dinosaurs from the distant past who encounter the Legion of Superheroes in the 30th century. And the idea, more or less, is that because reality itself is breaking down, then therefore these things are happening in multiple time periods, right? It's all sort of jumbled up and chaotic. It's a mess. But he said, even if it did happen in the 80s, if that next kind of time window happens in 1997, you could still run the crisis. So we did. Um, and it was a massive game. And because of that countdown, because everybody knew it was coming, I mean, 6 months before that, which would have been, I guess, February of 1997, I had people sending me emails like, are you really doing this? Like, are you really going to run a game? And I said, yeah, I absolutely am going to run a game. And so we did. We rented the town hall because we nobody had like a living room that was going to be big enough for dozens and dozens and dozens of players, right? So we rented a town hall. I rented a red tuxedo. We rented a really nice sound system, and we're playing music. The first song of the night was "It's the End of the World as We Know It," but I feel fine. Um, man, what am I leaving out? We had a keg of beer. I mean, it was just huge. It was just massive. And we invited everybody who had ever played the game, even if they only played once and had never done it again, we still sent them an invitation. And everybody showed up. And the only person who didn't show up was Greg Sheets. And it wasn't for lack of trying. He actually got lost on the way there because he lived in a different town than me and he was coming from a weird angle and he got turned around in small towns in an era before GPS. So he was the only one who didn't show up, and it was huge. And um we ran certain fights where it was, for instance, the fight with the anti-monitor was like everybody was in that fight. And I had set up the tables, and it was like tables like you'd have in a high school cafeteria, basically, right? And so we had like a gigantic square made out of tables, where each side of the square would be like two tables long. And like I had to really kind of speak up for people to hear me. People were so far away from me. And so at any rate, I was sort of like, if you were looking at it from overhead, I was like on the south side of the square, and I was the only one on the south side. The other three sides were all players, and I couldn't even tell you how many were there. I mean, it was full. It was ridiculous. Something else that was really cool was there were so many people meeting for the first time. Guys were shaking hands, and they were like, I played with Chris in the 80s and was a speedster, and they'd be shaking hands with another guy going, yeah, I'm playing with Chris right now in college, and I'm the current speedster, stuff like that. It was very, very cool. Um, but if you've listened to the 80s Crisis game, you kind of know already basically what happened. If you haven't checked out that video yet, by all means, go check that out. So I was wanting to talk more about the out of game stuff here, but which I have. It was a massive game. We actually got Papa John's to sponsor it because I knew the guy at the local Papa John's. They donated, I couldn't even tell you, like, I don't know, 20 pizzas or something. We had a banner on the table where I was using as my GM stuff. The we had a big banner across the front of it that said Papa John's. Um, we started around, I want to say, 8 p.m. We were still playing at 8 a.m. That morning, by the way, was the day that the royal family in England, Princess Diana, her, that was actually the morning she died. We heard about that as we were leaving the game. Everybody was exhausted. Everybody wanted to go home and sleep. And on the drive home, I remember driving home with Josh and John Boggs, and we heard about that whole thing had happened that morning. But at any rate, yeah, it was huge. It was a massive, massive event. Um, to this day, my players will write me and say how much they loved that game, and that it kind of like ruined them for all other games, basically. Just in terms of the scope, you know. And then the other thing was a year later, on August 29th of 1998, I remember a bunch of those guys going, "Hey, we should do that again." And I was like, "Dude, I spent kind of a lot of money on that. I don't want to drop, like hundreds of dollars, every August, if this becomes like an annual thing." They're like, "No, just but run a game and have it like thematically tie in somehow." And so we did. It became a tradition. So every year on August 29th, I run something that is kind of our big event of the year, you know, or something significant happens. Like I will kill off a major NPC or something like that, that, people are going to miss that guy because I go out of my way to not bring people back from the dead. So it's always a big deal. And my players kind of look forward to every August 29th, and they also kind of dread every August 29th in a way because they know that's when like stuff's going to go down. But yeah, and then years after that, because of that time nature of the crisis, for instance, every year that ends in a seven, we did it in 2007, we did it in 2017. I'll do it again in 2027. Um, we say basically the crisis in a way kind of happens again, right? And it's the characters from that time period are involved in it. So like in the 2007 game, we did stuff with Batman Beyond, and it was the Terry McGinnis Batman from 2007 was interacting with like Barbara Gordon back when she was still young. From his point of view, she's the commissioner of Gotham City, but he, interacts with her before she was the commissioner. Stuff like that. Um, what else should I mention? Oh, so another big thing that happens in the 97 crisis. Well, first of all, when we ran it in later years, right after we had ran the 97 crisis, DC did two big events. Excuse me. DC did one big event and Marvel did one big event, is what I meant to say. So Marvel's event was called Onslaught. And for those who don't know, Onslaught is basically the story of how, man, this is hard to explain. It's sort of like the conflict between Professor X and Magneto becomes personified and is an entity called Onslaught. And when the Marvel heroes fought him, it basically killed the Marvel universe. Like a ton of heroes died. And a year later, they did a thing called Heroes Reborn. But forget about that for a minute, right? Then the other thing that happened that was huge was over at DC, they did a thing called Genesis. And Genesis was like everybody loses their powers, or their powers are kind of on the fritz, where they kind of like they come and they go. And they end up having to go out into space, and it deals with characters like Highfather and Darkseid and so on and so forth, the new gods. And it turns out that um sort of at the time of creation, when the universe was created, this thing moved out from the epicenter. Think of like if you threw a rock in a pond. The rings that move out away from that point of impact in the DC universe, this is called the God Wave. And it passes over beings long ago and it turns them into the original gods, right? And then again, go back to the pond metaphor. When those rings reach the outside of your pond, they are then reflected and they come back in towards the center again, right? So on that second pass, then it creates the new gods. So that it creates characters like Darkseid and Highfather and all those guys, right? And then it gets to the center and then it's reflected out again, but it's dissipating. So each pass is weaker than the pass before it. And so then on the next pass, it creates the age of superheroes on Earth. And something that was really interesting then about that issue was it basically says everybody has the same power source, right? So so we ran that. We did that in the 2007 version of the crisis. But we said it took place in 1997. So just as in 1997 we were saying things took place in the 80s, right? In the early 2000s, we were still adding to the story of the 90s. Does that make sense? Um, a lot of people get really confused when I start to talk about that kind of thing. Think of it this way: in a lot of role-playing games, you might run a World War II game, right? And you're setting it in a previous era. You're in our game when we run a World War II adventure, we are plugging it into our continuity. But there's a lot of stuff in our timeline where we did not play it in chronological order. You're hearing it on my channel in chronological order, but that's not the order we played it in. If you're confused, say something in the comment section and I'll try to do a better job of explaining. But we are still adding to the 97 crisis, adding little scenes here and there, that we were like, oh, that would have been cool. Let's establish that, as part of our continuity. So that's what we did with Genesis and Onslaught was we plugged them in there and we said all that was going on too, right? because we just really wanted to cement the idea that everything hit the fan in August of 1997, that it was just ridiculous how many things were all going wrong at the same time. And so one of the things happening during all of this is is the John Redbridge story kind of reaches its climax. So if you follow the channel, you might already know what the deal is with him. A lot of people don't, though. So the real super fast recap is that he was created by the old ones. He was a cosmic being to fight for them in a space war against another group of cosmic beings called the Star Gods. Um, at the end of that war, the old ones just got sick of it and left. The Star Gods had overextended themselves throughout the course of the war. They were forced to fall back. The Eldar, which was his race, were suddenly without a purpose. And I'm going to fast forward their story a little bit. He is in a ship under the command of a guy named Nuada. They crash land on Earth in what today we would call Ireland. And the locals of the time can't understand concepts of like what is an alien or whatever, right? So they call them gods. And the name that they give John Redbridge back then was Dagda. And um, one of the other members of his race is the Morrigan. And there's a battle where Nuada is injured and loses an arm and stuff like that, and he can no longer lead. Dagda takes over, and to the Celtic people, then he becomes the king of that pantheon of gods, right? And so Dagda is in a way kind of like Zeus from Greek mythology or Odin from Norse mythology. But then he's also kind of pulling double duty where he's not just like the all father and like the god of magic and the god of power and stuff like that, right? But he is also their god of love and like fertility and sex. And so he is sort of like a male version of Aphrodite, or for the Norse stuff, and this is Marvel Comics, they've got the Enchantress, who is kind of like, their Aphrodite in a way. He has all of those qualities, right? And one of the things with the Enchantress, if you're familiar with her, is quote unquote, no man can resist her except for Thor. He was special, and that was kind of not plot armor. What is the phrase? Plot convenience, whatever. You get what I'm saying, right? Because she appeared in his issues, he got to be immune. But that's kind of an outlier thing. With Dagda, nobody's immune. And with the Morrigan, like every 'cause with the Celts, they didn't really believe in fall and spring. They only had summer and winter. And so when summer became winter for them, that was Halloween or Samhain, right? And so they associated like the trees losing their leaves and stuff like that. They thought of winter as the season of death. Okay. And then, so the opposite of Samhain would be Beltane, which is May Day. And that is then when winter becomes summer, right? And they thought of summer as the season of life, and they thought the trees came back to life and stuff like that. I could go off on a big tangent about how they thought pine trees were awesome because they never lose their needles, and they kind of were worshiping pine trees and stuff, but that's a whole other discussion. The point is just that the more like to some extent the Dagda was associated with summer and the Morgan was associated with winter. And when May Day would roll around every year, she did not want to give up her power or whatever, right? In Celtic mythology. And so she literally was like, she becomes a Galactus level threat and is going to destroy the earth, right? And I'm not making this up. Dagda just comes in and he is so good in bed. calms her down for another year. So I always thought that was funny. But at any rate, yeah. So, he used to be doing stuff like that, and he was a huge deal. And we borrowed a lot from the White Wolf role-playing games, specifically Changeling the Dreaming. They talk a lot about the Tuatha De Danann and so on and so forth, and they become changelings. And the reason I bring it up is because Dagda at one point is hooking up with Wonder Woman back when she was young, which was, I want to say, she's born in 550 BC. So he would be hooking up with her uh around, I guess, I got to count down, right? So like 530 BC. Um Around in that ballpark. But at any rate, he was going to Paradise Island to visit her, and it's surrounded by mists that grant somebody unaging. So that's worth remembering for a minute. Then at one point, the two of them are in the Roman Empire, and we introduced the Ghost Rider of Rome, who was he was like a charioteer, and then the horse pulling his chariot looked like the Old West Ghost Rider, looked like his horse, and then like the chariot wheels were on fire, and he looked kind of like like the way the Roman chariot drivers would be dressed, in that kind of armor. But then, of course, he had like the flaming skull head and all that. He used a power called Penance Stare on Dagda when Dagda was a changeling. And the White Wolf system gets really, really into all the things going on in the world back then that were affecting the changelings and weakening them, right? So the Penance Stare put him over the edge where he basically lost all those powers. And the only reason he still has unaging is because of visiting Paradise Island. Other than that, he's just human. So then after that, he becomes the basis for the legend of King Arthur, right? And that's why Arthur's not famous for being like a cosmic being like he used to be back when he was created to go do stuff in out in the stars and fight in this massive war against the star gods. Um, he was the basis for Beowulf. In the time of Shakespeare, he was the basis for Oberon, and then Morgan was Titania. But we detail all of this on the channel. But so point being, he's been weak for a really long time, right? He'd been stripped of his powers. And so right before the crisis happens in 1997, he's got the Infinity Gauntlet. And one of the things that he does, because when Howard was running stuff where I was playing Dagda and Howard was the GM and all that, he treated the Infinity Gauntlet as an absolute, that it was just you make a wish and whatever you wish for happens, period. It was not measured in APs, there were no levels, it was just an absolute. So, one of the big stories to come out of the crisis then is Dagda makes a wish with it that he was back to the way he was made, right? And so he becomes that cosmic being again, the level of guy who could fight the star gods. He gets his powers back because he needs that to go fight the anti-monitor. Um, and then the other thing is once that, well, another thing, I left a part out. Sorry, I left a part out. Um, he also had, there's in DC Heroes, there's a power called Split. And so, for instance, Triplicate Girl of the Legion of Superheroes is a great example of this, where she can split into three people, right? Let's just say for a moment, because at one point one of her selves dies and she becomes Duo Damsel. But at any rate, a character who just splits in two, for the sake of argument, let's say they normally have a strength of 4, right? When they split, that would go down one. So now they are two characters who both have a strength of three. Okay, does that make sense? Through the course of the game, and again, we've detailed it on the channel, Dagda has been split into many, 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 many versions of himself. And part of that was inspired by his write up in an old Dungeons and Dragons book called Deities and Demigods, where they list stats for him. And they call him the Dozen King, where he can create a dozen of himself at will. So we were kind of referencing that in a way. We had these guys all over the place, right? So finally, in the big crisis in 1997, it's like a lot of those characters with the split power where they shut it off and they all get sucked back into being one guy again. We do the exact same thing. So now there's only one John Redbridge. He's just this one massive dude. And because now he's got the whole Dagda thing, like I said before, where Dagda just had like a harem of characters in Celtic mythology, we do the same thing except with modern characters, right? And so we had seen where the individual John Redbridges had had these various little love stories, over the years, that they all come together as well, right? And are helping him fighting the anti-monitor and so on and so forth. And because, again, like I said, when the Morrigan is going to destroy the world and is a Galactus level threat, the answer to that problem is in his pants. So, so likewise, we just kind of said, all these girls are still pretty happy with the arrangement, even though there's just one of them now. Because again, he's like cosmically whatever. Let's be super honest. Let's call a spade a spade. Dagda was the original Mary Sue. He really is. As a young gamer, I didn't really know that yet. I didn't know what a Mary Sue was. We sort of fix a lot of that in later adventures, but we're not to that point in the timeline yet. Okay, so point being, now he's got this harem of like all the girls from comic books, pretty much. He's got all this massive power, and he's got the Infinity Gauntlet. Again, Mary Sue territory. So he fights the Anti Monitor. And the Anti Monitor actually um, banishes him to a different dimension. He sends him into the antimatter universe, which sucks. And Howard ran this part of it. When you put the infinity gems in another dimension, they lose their power. So he runs out of that, but he still has all of the power he had from the beginning, and he literally has every power from Changeling to Dreaming. And we kind of mentioned that in a recent World of Darkness thing I talked about. He literally has every power in the book. So at the end of the day, he uses a power, which you'll have to forgive me. I can't remember the name of it now. Because unfortunately, like with DC heroes, stuff makes sense. The flight power is called flight, right? In Changeling, they have stupid names for all the powers. So it's always like, whatever, birds of a feather is like the kind of stuff is what lets you fly. And I'm like, why don't you just call it flight? Um, So yeah, I can't remember what it's called, but it basically means you sort of remove somebody from history in a way, right? So well, you do and you don't. Like if someone had taken a photograph of the anti-monitor, the photograph itself still exists, even though now it's a photograph of nothing, right? So that confuses players because they're like, well, wait a minute, why would you have even pointed the camera in that direction and taken a picture? Like it doesn't make sense. That's how the power works, though. So everything the anti-monitor did is still in play. If he killed somebody, that guy's still dead. It's just that after the anti-monitor vanishes, people can't remember how that guy died, right? Again, hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, let me know in the comment section. I'll try to do a better job explaining it. But yeah, that was what was going on. So there was another big moment in the crisis, which is Kelson. Kelson Barber was my best friend in college. I'm not trying to throw Kelson under the bus right now. I have nothing against him. Um, Everybody was really confused what happened that night. Uh, Kelson apologized to me after that night, and I can't remember now what he was saying was going on. Like he was sleep deprived, he was in a bad mood. His girlfriend just broke up with him. I don't know what all was going on there, but um he decided to sabotage the heroes though. And part of what was going on in the crisis was there were these like giant tuning forks. And at one point the heroes had to protect them against shadow demons. So Kelson crushed one. He was a Green Lantern and he made a big green hand and he tried to crush the tuning fork. And so there were certain characters like Tachyon, who I've mentioned. Tachyon is the chief of security on the Nematon, which was this weird ship the heroes had been using to like get around in the crisis. Like if they had to go into the Anti-Monitor universe to fight uh, the the Anti-Monitor, I meant to say the Antimatter universe. But if they have to go into the Antimatter universe to fight the Anti-Monitor, they would travel there on the Nematon. And um, so Tachyon had been the chief of security and he had time travel. So if something bad happened, he would deal with it. Um, so he did. And then they uh John Redbridge uses that changeling power and he makes the anti-monitor vanish. And then the last villain of the whole night was Necron, Lord of the Unliving, who a lot of people will know from the Blackest Night comics. He was like the main entity behind the Black Lantern Corps, which is all associated with death. So he was sort of the big bad final guy. And like I said earlier, when I was talking about Celtic mythology and Dagda's associated with summer and life and stuff like that, Necron is like this ultimate entity in the DC universe associated with death. So, um, that was the first time they fought him when he wasn't in his Ultron sort of body that he had been in before. Those were still running around. He was using them kind of as minions now. Um, but he was in his true form finally, with like the skull face and all that, just like he is in the comics. So they fought him, and Tachyon did something kind of interesting, which was Tachyon banished Necron through time backwards into his younger self, which then meant Necron would move forward to the point where he got banished. And so he was stuck in this little time loop. And that took Necron out of play then. And so he, up until this point in the campaign, had been the big bad. And so then he was dealt with. I'm trying to think of anything else. I can't think of any other big things from the crisis. Really, the takeaway from the crisis of 1997 slash the Genesis event slash the Onslaught event was that, when it's all said and done, the Earth K is still here. And I had threatened everybody, and I meant it. Just like when I say I'll kill off a character and I'll leave them dead because there needs to be consequences. I told everybody, like, if things go badly tonight, Earth K dies, and you guys can use the Nematon as like an escape pod almost from your dimension, and we will go to a different dimension and we will start all over. Um, if you fail, so they were sweating it. They knew when I said that I meant it. But yeah, Earth K is here, today, obviously. So you know how that turned out. But that was it. That was the big game of 1997. We loved it. We thought it was awesome. I guarantee I'm not even coming close to doing it justice here. Um, if you have any questions about it, let me know in the comments. While you're at it, make sure you smash that like button and check to see if you're still subscribed because YouTube loves to unsubscribe people without telling them. And I think that's it for me today. So, from everybody here at the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. We hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure. Bye.